In today's lesson, we're going to review all the different things that caused the decline of feudal society. So, in other words, in today's world, we don't live in a feudal society, which means feudalism ended at some point. When was it? Why did it happen? We're going to look at the reasons that feudalism ends today. Your lesson goal is you want to be able to explain the reasons that contributed to the decline of feudalism. Your job today is going to be to watch this video and answer the question in your digital notebook. So, in your notebook, you are going to be filling in this chart. We have 4 topics. The 4 things listed below all contributed to the decline of feudalism. We have the 100 Years' War, the Crusades, growth of trade, and Black Death. As you listen, you're going to fill in this chart and list all the different right ways that these topics contributed to the end of feudalism. So, let's review. What is feudalism? Well, our definition for the feudal system or feudalism is that it is a strict social system in which landowners grant people land or other rewards in exchange for military service or labor. So in the feudal system, you have a hierarchy. At the bottom of the hierarchy, you have your workers. These are your serfs and peasants. This makes up the most amount of people. Above those people, you have your knights, and then your nobles, and at the top of the hierarchy is a king. And remember, this whole system is a system of give and take. The king gives nobles land in return. The nobles give the king taxes and protection. The nobles take their land and break it up into little pieces and give pieces of the land to the knights, who in return give back to the nobles protection and taxes. The knights take the land they're given and give pieces of the land to the peasants and serfs. And the serfs and peasants are working the land. They're running the farms, they're the millers, they're doing all the things that help keep society moving. In return for doing all that hard work, the peasants give back to the knights food and resources. So we have a system here that works because each group is performing give and take, and it ties people closely to their social class. Now, something is going to happen to throw this all off balance. The king at the top is going to wind up becoming much too powerful. So what are the different things that happen to cause this? So let's first look at the 100 Years' War. So because of the 100 Years' War, we see some interesting things happening. The first is that professional armies start to come about. So in the feudal system, if there's a war that's going to break out, the king will say to the nobles, bring your armies. We need to go fight this battle. The nobles in turn will call on their knights. The knights are fighting for their noble. They're not fighting for their country. So the knights are loyal to the noble that they fight for instead of fighting for their country. At the end of the 100 Years' War, we start to see professional armies. These armies are dedicated to the country. So you now have an English army. You now have a French army. As a result, we start to see something called nationalism or patriotism. So people, instead of being really proud of the noble that they fight for or work under as dictated by the feudal system, are now really proud of the country. They're fighting for France. They're fighting for England, rather than just the area of the country they come from. So we start to see this sense of pride in one's country. Finally, we see new military technology. Specifically, gunpowder and longbow are put to use in this war. So the longbow and gunpowder are really important because the longbow is sort of like a really big version of a bow and arrow. And this can fire an arrow so hard that it can pierce a knight's armor. We have gunpowder, meaning people now have the use of things like cannons and guns. Because you have cannons and guns, these also can pierce a knight's armor. And so you're able to now say that what's the purpose of a knight if a knight's armor isn't going to be protected by weapons like this? And so, as a result, we can circle back to these professional armies. You have larger professional armies that fight in these battles. And so all of these different things are going to bring about the decline of feudalism, because you're going to need more people in military roles. Another thing that brings about the decline of feudalism is the Crusades. So when the Crusades happen, what it really is an eye-opener for the world, for the medieval European world. Because these people are living in a time that's not as advanced as it was, say, 800 years ago at the fall of Rome. But remember that in Western Europe, that's the only time that we really have sort of this backwards cultural movement. If we look at other parts of the world, culture and knowledge and ideas, they're growing and they're thriving. So when the Europeans leave Europe and they head over to fight in the Holy Land, they see a whole new world, a whole new better world. And so they see these great ideas. They see things like hospitals and libraries and algebra. They see new forms of science being studied. People are being treated with medicine. And they realize this is a much, much better way to live. And so all these ideas that they learn when they're in the Holy Land, they in turn bring back to Europe. And this helps to improve society. It brings them up out of the Middle Ages. Another really important thing that brings about the decline of feudalism is trade. So during the Middle Ages, Europe is pretty isolated, meaning it's not connecting with the rest of the world. Trade isn't happening at a large scale at this time. But when the Europeans go and they see all these better things that we just discussed, they realize when they go back to Europe, they don't want to go back and not have those wonderful things anymore. And so they set up trade. And trade will start to happen with Europe between all different areas of the world. We have it with the Holy Land, with the Middle East, with China and with India. All of this is going to bring in new products, new resources, new ideas. And this is going to help to establish what we're going to talk about later, and that's a new role. That's a new class system. This is going to be our merchant class that's going to really emerge and thrive here. We talked about another thing that happened, and that's weapons and warfare. And so when the Crusaders go and fight in these battles, they fight with some new weapons. They fight with things like crossbows and catapults, and most importantly, gunpowder. And when they bring these ideas, these new weapons back to Europe and implement them, it's going to change feudal society. Because again, as we see later in the 100 Years' War, which we talked about earlier, there's not going to be a need for these knights in shining armor. Instead, you're going to need armies made up of more soldiers. And there's not going to be a need for these big castles being built with these big walls around them, because a cannon is able to destroy the walls. And so we're going to see society changing because of these new weapons in warfare, because you're going to need less knights and more soldiers, people who are dedicating their lives to being soldiers. And then the last thing that happens with the Crusades that brings about the decline of feudal societies, that because kings become more powerful. And why is this? Well, the kings become more powerful because there's less lords. So when the Pope Urban II called on crusaders, he said, hey, crusaders, if you go and fight, you're going to get a free ticket to heaven. And that was really appealing. And so in order to fund this really expensive trip, a lot of lords and nobles went ahead. They sold their manors. And who has enough money to sell their manors? To buy manors? Well, that would be the king. And so a lot of these nobles sold their lands and their holdings to the king. There was also less lords and nobles because some stayed, some never came back from the Crusades. And then another reason there were less lords and nobles is because some were killed and never came back. And so the king takes all that power for himself. Because there's less lords and nobles, the king is going to become more powerful. So if you think of that hierarchy we looked at, all of a sudden the king's role is swelling. The king is going to become much, much more powerful. In fact, we talked a lot about earlier, who is more powerful, the king or the pope? After the Crusades, we're going to see that the king definitely is more powerful. Another thing that brings about the decline of feudal society is the growth of trade. So what happens when that growth of trade starts to happen after we see the Crusades? Well, we start to see cities and towns begin to grow. People start to leave the countryside and move into cities and towns, and they start to use their talents and their knowledge to create products that they'll sell. And so we see a whole new class starting to emerge. And this class is going to become pretty large and pretty powerful because of the wealth that it has. And this is called the merchant class. And so if you think back again to that hierarchy, we now have something new, the merchant class, which is going to sort of take on or usurp the power and the wealth of those upper classes we see in feudal society. So this is going to throw off that whole dynamic. And then we look at what is probably the biggest reason for the decline of feudal society, and that's the Black Death. The Black Death is so important because in this event, or events, because it happens again and again and again, lots and lots and lots of the population dies. So if we start looking economically at the results of the Black Death, well, first, the population is going to dramatically drop. You have a third to a half of your population just gone. So if we think of this as cause and effect, because remember, history is all cause and effect, we start with our population dramatically decreasing. As a result, you're going to have a much greater demand for workers. So let's say you are a noble and you have 100 serfs working for you. And so those serfs work hard to make your manor function. All of a sudden, 50 of those serfs are gone. You, in order to be profitable, need your manor to be well run. So those 50 serfs then are much more valuable. They can demand greater pay for their work so that your manor will run. And so this demand for workers results in higher wages for those workers, and prices of goods become more valuable. So you have less, say, cobblers making shoes. Shoes are going to be much more valuable because you have less shoes on the market. So all of these things make your lower class much more important and much more powerful. This is going to bring about, again, the decline of feudalism. Feudalism is going to end because of this. So that's economically how the Black Death affects the decline of feudal society. But let's look at socially. So socially, it also changes things because it spurs changes in public health and greater emphasis on clinical medicine and not superstition. And so we have this shift from a superstitious society, maybe believing more in mystical types of ways to help and heal. And now we have a change where people want scientific types of medicines and treatments. And we use this as an example, but really we have a shift in mindset more towards science and scientifically based types of things. And this makes sense, especially since people are bringing back these great ideas from the Crusades. We're going to want some health that is really going to be effective. So we can tie this in then with the church. The church, we know, was really, really powerful, probably more powerful than the king. But this is going to change. And why is it going to change? It's because people start to question their beliefs in the church. When the Black Death happened, when bodies were piling up, when they couldn't even handle burying all their dead friends and families, people turned to the church, they prayed, they asked the Pope for help. There's no help to be had. And so this dramatically shook the way that people looked at the world. We always talk about how in medieval society, the church is the center of everything. But after the Black Death, people stop believing so deeply in the church because the church didn't save them from the kiss of death that the Black Death was. And so we have 4 different topics among many, but these are the 4 main reasons that we have the decline of feudalism. And that's the 100 Years' War, the Crusades, growth of trade, and the Black Death. Thank you for listening.